Today, when we look at California, it's got the highest number of homeless people in the United States. Half of all of America's homeless live in California. 1/3 of all the welfare recipients in the United States live in California. 1/5 of all Californians live below the poverty line. California yet has the highest taxes in the country in the aggregate. The highest property taxes because of the enormous assessed evaluations. Maybe not highest of any given state, but highest in the sense of their contribution to the highest aggregate. Highest sales tax at over 10 to 11%. Highest income tax at up to 13.2%. And the result of all of that is the middle class finds itself unable to pay and be competitive with other businesses in other states. In other words, they look at all of these higher taxes and they say to themselves, I'm willing to pay it if I'm economically viable, but the regulations that the state creates fall heavily on the small farmer, the hardware store owner, the tire owner, but not necessarily on the Silicon Valley Corporation that has an array of lawyers or legal teams or analysts or economists that find ways not to pay it. And so the middle class leaves. They vote with their feet. They go to places where it's more conducive for middle class livelihoods. We've lost somewhere between 8 and 12 million people of the middle class. And then we have allowed about 20 million people over the last 50 years to enter the United States under illegal auspices. Half of that number came to California. That may have been a humanitarian achievement, but it required enormous sums in capital and labor and time to integrate, to intermarry, and to assimilate people. And for years, California's had the highest level of poor people. What did that mean as far as the middle class tax burden went? A middle class California once had the finest roads, as I said, the finest airports, the finest schools, and the finest reservoirs and aqueducts. Today, we have not built an aqueduct in California in about 40 years. The schools that were rated in the top 10% of comparative state rankings are now in the bottom 10%. The airports are decrepit. The University of California system that used to be the finest in the world essentially now has an open admissions policy. And if we look at test scores and records of achievement, the means have gone down every year. So in other words, as taxes climbed, as the number of poor people increased, as the entitlement burden grew, the middle class said, it seems almost ironic or maybe paradoxical or Orwellian that the more taxes I pay, the worse schools I get, the more I can't fight against a drought, there's no water, the more expensive gas climbs up. And they said, I have to leave. But they also were worried not because the poor or the immigrant had done that alone. It was the wealthy. In this period, there was about $5 trillion in market capitalization that grew out of Silicon Valley alone. And we created sort of a medieval caste, a wealthy caste of barons and lords that were not subject to the consequences of their own ideology. So they had so much wealth, they felt they were exempt from worries about taxation, poor schools, poor airports. And their way of thinking, we have private jets, our kids go to prep school, my tax accountant finds a way to get out of paying burdensome taxes. If we don't have water, I can always find a source, drill my own private well, or deal with a bureaucrat to give me an extra allotment. I like to have high taxes on energy because I live in the Bay Area where it's a nice moderate climate. It's not 108 as if it is in Bakersfield. If the gas goes too high, I like the idea of reducing our carbon imprint, but mostly because I only drive a mile or two to my coastal job. I don't drive across the vast spaces of the Sierra or the Central Valley. In other words, we did exactly what the Greeks and Romans and medieval thinkers warned us about. We created a very, very wealthy elite that was not subject to the consequences of their own ideology, and whether out of virtue signaling and guilt or whether out of contrived political necessity, they made a political alliance with the very poor of California. And the poor said, give us more entitlements, tax the middle class, transfer that money to us, we need it. And the wealthy said, yes, we will. We'll open the borders, we'll transfer money, but you have to vote for issues that we're in favor of, and we're in favor of them precisely because they don't affect us. The middle class is never very popular among the rich and the poor, and you can see that in the vocabulary. As a philologist, I always look at the words people use. And whereas before, middle class voters and their preferred candidates were said, these are solid choices. These are the yeomen of the state. These are the genuine Americans. Today, they're called clingers, the clingers of Pennsylvania, as our President Obama called them.
So it's not surprising then that they get bitter. They cling to guns or religion or antipathy towards people who aren't like them.
Hillary Clinton, a candidate for president in 2016, used the term deplorable and irredeemable.
You could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. Right?
Joe Biden used the term chumps and dregs of society.
There are a small percentage of the American people, virulent people, some of them the dregs of society. And instead of using the full might of the executive branch.
And the idea was that, and we're going to see this later on, that as globalization took hold and muscular labor was no longer essential to the American experiment. In other words, you could have things made overseas in China or Southeast Asia or Mexico, and the great middle-class territory of the Middle West of the United States, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, started to become hollowed out. We confused cause and effect. We said, well, people of the middle class are on drugs, or they're committing suicide, or they're dysfunctional, or they're not worth saving. And we created this vocabulary of disparagement. If they really had any gumption, they'd go to the oil fields, or they'd learn coding. Who needs to assemble? Who needs to manufacture? Who needs to use their arms? And we wrote off an entire section of America, which was the middle class. The erosion of the middle class is something that the ancient philosophers, and indeed our own founding fathers, warned about. The erosion of the middle class leads to a society of two classes, wealthy and poor, oppressed and oppressor, a binary that's very unstable. And the best word I could use to term it would be medieval. And so we've ended up in our own society doing exactly what we thought would never happen in America. We've taken the middle class, the backbone of citizenship, and we've eroded it and destroyed it.